Okay, so finally, World War II. We have come through a lot of history here. So we're in the years 1939 to 1945. Now, AP Euro doesn't ask all of the nitty gritty about World War II. Very long to go through it. We're going to be mainly worried with causes, turning points, effects, social changes, just like the other things we've covered in AP Euro, but not everything. And so where we kind of left off was, World War One, the Great War, or what they thought was a war to end all wars, and that is where they put in place this idea of collective security and peace, or had set up these things that they thought would keep an enduring peace. But as we're going to see, because World War One doesn't stay the Great War, it will be World War One as we get World War Two. It did not create an enduring peace, and mainly because Woodrow Wilson didn't get his way. He didn't get all of those points, and he fought so hard for his baby there and the 14 points, and also because France and Britain really wanted revenge. So the Treaty of Versailles really becomes this epic fail, and is going to be one of the causes of World War II. Remember, the severe punishment of Germany due to Article 231 resulted in conservative German resentment against the dictated peace, or the diktat, because they had no say in it, and Hitler's going to use that and play on these resentments, or the stab in the back, to create his fascist regime. Wilson and the League of Nations, because Wilson couldn't get the U.S. to be involved, and the USSR isn't in it, does not have the will or the support to maintain peace. And during the 1930s, the League will essentially stand by. This is a big key part. I'm going to say it over and over again. The League of Nations is just going to stand by and not do anything. While aggressors like Germany and Italy are going to invade other countries and directly violate provisions of the Versailles Treaty. And we're going to see eventually that the USSR is even going to pull out of the League of Nations. The U.S. is not in it. And the League of Nations just really doesn't do its job in regards to collective security. And so one of the first examples of the League of Nations just kind of standing by is we're going to start to have this armament race again. If you remember, that was one of our letters in the acronym MANIA, or militarism. And so we're going to see after World War I that the League of Nations doesn't do anything to stop the naval arms race between the West and Japan. And we're going to come back to Japan and what that means as we move towards World War II by them not being, held down. And so we're going to get some treaties that come out of this. There's going to be a Washington Naval Conference, 1921 to 1922, but it's not going to do much to stop this naval arms race. And the treaties that come out of this are numbers. They're like ratios. So like the 5-power treaty creates a 5-5-3 battleship ratio between the U.S., Britain, and Japan. And so they're named this because, and then we're going to look at the 4-power treaty in just a second. Name this because it was like you can have 5 battleships and they can have 5 battleships. What happens is smaller naval vessels were exempt from the agreement, so it only dealt with one kind of ship. So what would you do? You would keep the ratio of the ship you're allowed, but then start producing a bunch of other kinds of ships that weren't in the ratio. And what we're going to notice is Japan always got fewer or less, the ability to have less, and this is going to create some tension here. The 4-power treaty is going to replace the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, and it's going to bound Britain, Japan, France, and the U.S. to preserve status quo in the Pacific, a concession to Japan's favor. So we'll come back to all this, but remember, anytime there's armament, that is one of our main causes leading up into, if you got a weapon, you're going to use it, just like we talked about in World War I. And also, we're going to see the League of Nations does little to enforce the paper agreements that we talked about. You should remember these of the 1920s. So there's few enforcement. It was remember we talked about idealistic, like the spirit of Locarno, and like letting Germany back into the cousinhood of nations and all of these things. But there were few enforcement. They were very idealistic, like we just want it to work. So the Locarno Pact of 1925, Germany and other European nations had agreed to settle all disputes peacefully. And it had given Europeans a false sense of security, or idealistic sense of security about the future. And we'll see that with no enforcement, the spirit of Locarno will be no longer relevant once Hitler took power, because the provisions were not enforceable. We also got the Kellogg-Briand Pact here, named after 2 individuals in 1928. If you'll remember, this is where 62 nations signed a treaty proclaiming war is illegal unless for purely defensive purposes. But it's like, what are you going to do if a country breaks it? Like, they go to war with another country, and then the only way you can stop it is to go to war. And so it's completely unenforceable and idealistic. And Hitler will later claim that his aggressive military ventures were for defensive purposes. So Hitler's going to use this, for twist it for his own needs. And so this is another act where the League of Nations fails by having no enforcement policies. And so then another factor here, if you remember, we're kind of tying everything together of where we've been and where we're going. The Great Depression hits, and it's going to result in the rise of fascism in Japan and Germany, as we've discussed. It's already in Italy before the Great Depression, just like we had discussed with Mussolini. And then we're going to need to talk about Japan for the first time in this lecture, but not the last, and what's going to be going on there. So we're going to bounce out of Europe here a couple times, but you need to know about these things because Japan is going to get involved in World War II. And so what's going on with them is going to be important as a side note as we're moving forward. So we're going to see in 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria. If you'll notice on the map here, here's Manchuria. It's a northern part of China. And this is an aggressive nationalistic move for resources, just as we'd seen some of the imperialism earlier with other nations. And so again, the League of Nations is going to do very little. They condemn the invasions. They're like, oh, bad Japan, but they did little by the way of sanctions. So they do put a couple sanctions on Japan as like, slap on the hand, bad Japan. But they were supposed to stop them. That is part of the collective security, and they do not. And Japan, because of the few little sanctions that the League did put on them, pulls out of the League of Nations because of this. And then we're also going to see that Hitler is going to withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933 and is going to begin to secretly rearm or build up the military, which was in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So now we have the U.S. that was never in, the USSR is out, Germany is now out because of Hitler, and is secretly rearming, and Japan is out of the League of Nations. So we're going to see, the ineffectiveness of the League. And so the weakness of the League is going to be shown at the London Economic Conference in 1933, which failed to achieve international cooperation in remedying the Depression because everyone is looking out for themselves and the League is very weak. We've had all of these major powers pull out. The U.S. is going to play a major role in undermining the treaty, and the conference's failure is going to send a strong signal to Hitler that the democracies lack the organization and the will to address international crises. If you were Hitler, you're going to be like, oh, look, the League isn't doing anything if you break the rules. And it's really going to give him that sign, like, I can do this. I can achieve what I want to because the League is not going to step in. And so a very powerful signal is sent to Hitler about what he can do because the League is showing its weakness. And so the Stresa Front is going to happen. It's going to be a conference in 1935 where Italy, France, and Britain are going to meet, and it's named after the city that they met in. And they meet because Mussolini and others grow concerned when Hitler withdrew from the Versailles Treaty, and Hitler, because he's like, I can do this, the League isn't going to do anything, starts making moves toward Austria. He's Austrian, they speak German, and the Austrian Nazis have just assassinated the Chancellor of Austria. So Hitler's going to make his move towards Austria, and Italy is going to be worried, or namely Mussolini, because Mussolini is not friends yet with Hitler, but that's coming because Hitler is coming close to Italy's border. And so they have this meeting protesting strongly, understanding the danger of Hitler making this move so they're against Germany taking over Austria and agree to use force to maintain the political status quo in Europe. Ironically, however, a year later, Mussolini is going to ally with Hitler to help fascists win in the Spanish Civil War, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And so the Stresa Front is going to fall apart because of this, but at first they start to try to ally against Hitler. But then Italy is going to have make some of its own moves here as well. And so Italy at this time, although worried about Hitler's moves, are going to start to make some of their own moves with an invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And this is mainly because of anger issues that Italy has. Like, they didn't get the Italia Irredenta with the Treaty of Versailles, didn't get the land that they were supposed to get. They'd had the earlier embarrassment of the Paris Peace Conference, and then the Treaty of Versailles is their second embarrassment. And then if you remember, they had this embarrassment in Ethiopia because they were the only country not to successfully imperialize in Africa. And so Mussolini is going to try to remedy this embarrassment by getting revenge on Ethiopians by an invasion here in 1935. And this time, 500,000 Ethiopians are going to die in the war compared to only 5,000 Italians. So it's very lopsided. And why? Is because they've had a chance, to try out all of these new weapon technology of World War I, so planes and tanks, etc. So they're able to come in. And here we see the League of Nations not doing anything about it again. They imposed light sanctions on Italy, but they didn't include sanctions on oil on the list of embargo goods. And what do you need to be a military state? You need oil. And so without embargoing oil, Italy is going to be able to become a war machine. And so why they didn't do anything more, they're scared of a bigger war. We've just come out of World War I. They're scared of this kind of conflict again. Italia Salisi, the ruler of Ethiopia at this time, begs for help from the League of Nations. He's like, no, you've got to do more. And he is known for this quote, which is rather prophetic. It's us today, you tomorrow, you should care. And this is going to be very prophetic as we move forward. But the League of Nations really does not answer the call here, and no attempt was made to prevent Italy's navy from using the Suez Canal on its way toward Ethiopia. France and Britain are pacifist at the time, and they're not willing to press Italy because they need Italy's help in keeping Hitler in check, just as they've talked just at the stress of front now. Britain in particular sought to appease Italy to end the crisis and only placed an embargo on the sale of British weapons to Italy. And in 1936, the League will even lift its sanction on Italy, and the Stresa Front will now become defunct as Mussolini clearly defied the League of Nations. And so earlier worried about Hitler doing it, but doesn't really care when it's Italy and himself doing it. And this is just going to be another, blinking light to Hitler that it is okay to do what you want, because the international community will lack the will to enforce peace. The League is still doing nothing. The League of Nations, he's going to say, will not stop me. Okay, now Spain. No, you didn't see this one coming. We briefly mentioned the Spanish Civil War just in the context of Germany earlier, and so some of this will be review. But it's been a really long time since we've talked about the Spanish, just, as the Spanish, pretty much since the War of Spanish Succession in 1713. So now it's 1936. And so Spain has been holding on to its monarchy this whole time, the Bourbons. But in 1931, there's going to be a provisional government put in place, and it is going to be set up. It's kind of a Republican with a little r, and then like we've seen with other provisional governments, like in Germany, the Weimar Republic, there's going to be elections then. And we're going to see that at this time that the church and state are going to be very separate in Spain, which is a huge difference from where we left off, Isabella and Ferdinand and how connected the church and the state were. Schools are going to be secular at this time. Jesuits will be dissolved. They're going to take land from the rich under this provisional government and give it to the poor, but not that much land. And so the problem with this provisional government, just like others we've seen, is everyone is still unhappy. There's just not enough done for everyone. And this is going to set us up for the election of 1933. So you have the right or conservatives that are able to take over and are going to begin to rule very harshly under this election of 1933. But then that'll lead us to another election in 1936 where this new left, or they'll call themselves the Popular Front, which is really just a group of anarchists, populists, socialists, communists, little r, Republicans that are against the old conservative order. They are going to win. And what they're going to do is they're going to turn towards the military. The left is going to win, and the military is going to decide to overthrow the government and asks a general to help them do it. And this is where we're going to get into a whole bunch of Fs. And so the military, with the help of Generalissimo Francisco Franco, a fascist, so FFF, Francisco Franco the fascist, sought to overthrow the little r Republican government in Spain, and to restore power of the Catholic Church and destroy socialism and communism in Spain. It's going to cause then a civil war to erupt between two groups. So one, the fascist or phalangelist. So now we have Francisco Franco, the fascist phalangelist, so FFFF, against the little r Republican side, or what will be called loyalists. And so we're going to see that Mussolini and Hitler, this is going to cause them to become friends. They are going to support Franco and use the conflict as a testing ground for their military forces. They support Franco because they're in support of fascism. And so they're going to come in on this side. It's going to be a devastating civil war. 600,000 people are going to die. Everyone is killing each other. And Mussolini and Hitler are going to use this as a dress rehearsal for World War II. We're going to see Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe. It's going to be practice for them. They're going to bomb anti-fascist or Republican-held cities like Madrid and Barcelona. And this is where we come back to that painting that I had showed you of Guernica. Pablo Picasso is going to paint this masterpiece in 1937 showing the horrors of the Civil War on civilians. So here's Picasso's painting again. We've taken some time to look at it. Remember, there's a really cool video on YouTube. I'll try to remember to link where someone's taken it like all 3D so you can kind of like walk through it. But it just shows the horrors of this Civil War, especially the horrors of planes now not being just used for surveillance, but being used for bombing, which is going to become a big part of World War II. And so this is really the test run that Italy and Germany needed to see if this was effective. And it was. It's going to be devastating during the Spanish Civil War. And so something else that we need to note here on other parties involved or not involved is that you would think Great Britain and France would come in to help the Republic, but they don't want war to spread. And the U.S. is also going to stay out. So we see some super neutrality here. And in fact, we're going to see that Great Britain helps expand neutrality laws at this time and gets 27 nations to proclaim non-intervention. But we will see that some get involved, like Russia or the USSR is going to come in on the side of the Republicans. So you need to remember here that fascists hate communists and communists hate fascists. And so this is why the USSR is going to get involved. If the U.S. had got involved here, maybe things would have been a lot different. But we're going to see that because Franco is supported because he's fascist by Italy and Germany, and the Republic or Republicans with a little r or loyalists are supported by the USSR, we're going to see the world divide kind of into two camps. Also, a really bad thing is we're going to see Germany and Italy become friends because of fascism. And the war kind of divide here. Britain and France, however, are going to officially recognize Franco's government here, just trying to stay, we don't want things to spread. And the League of Nations, again, should they have done something? I mean, it wasn't like a war between two countries. It was a civil war, but there were other countries involved. So, I mean, it's kind of questionable, but the League of Nations, again, proves ineffective, this time in helping Republican loyalists against Franco, so not stopping this thing, and is ineffective in patrolling Spain's borders to prevent supplies from reaching Franco's forest. And so we're going to see all of these camps and the ineffectiveness and the passivity of Britain and the U.S. Really leading to some problems here. And France's issue of the war is actually going to split the government and lead to the fall of the leftist Popular Front. And so the result of the Spanish Civil War, Franco will win the war and impose a fascist dictatorship in Spain, mainly due to the help from Germany and Italy. And in response to this military cooperation of Italy and Germany in Spain, the Rome-Berlin Axis will be formed, also sometimes known as the Fascistturm, just like we had the Comintern or like the International Communist. This is the International Fascist. And this will create an alliance between fascist Italy and Germany. And this will be what becomes later the Axis powers. So remember, like an axis, everything rotates around it, and so they believe everything should revolve around their fascism. And this is going to lead to Germany and Hitler moving even further against violating the Versailles Treaty, because they see very clearly, or Hitler definitely sees, that the League, if the League isn't going to stop in and do anything, then I can do whatever I want. So Hitler's first step in directly violating the Versailles Treaty is going to be he's going to begin drafting men into the military, also building up or rearming in the mid-1930s, knowing that the worst thing that could happen that the League has ever shown is maybe a slap on the wrist. And then he's going to take it one step further in like what you would call his rolling of the dice move. And he will even, I'll give you some quotes and a little bit of what he says about this later, but it'll be the most decisive move and also nerve-wracking move for him in his dictatorship career. So in 1936, Hitler is going to take his big gamble, or show his courage in the fact that he does not think the League will step in because they have been really futile in early crises. And so he takes this gamble in 1936 to reoccupy the Rhineland. If you remember, that is the buffer zone set up by the Treaty of Versailles. And it had been German land, but it's supposed to be, demilitarized to give this buffer zone for France. And so he sends 32,000 troops in, and he tells his troops if there is any resistance, he tells his high leadership, if there's any resistance by the French, get out. And so he probably would have stopped here if it had failed. If anybody had gone against him, remember, Germany's army is still not that strong. They've been under all of these conditions, and he's just started to rearm. And Hitler even says later in his career that when we marched in, if the French would have done anything, we would have withdrawn with our tail between our legs. And he said that this 40 hours after the invasion of the Rhineland, or the reoccupation of the Rhineland, were the most nerve-wracking of his career. And that they could have, the whole thing, everything that comes after could have been shattered if France would have just stood up. But France was unwilling to enforce the Treaty of Versailles without British aid. And the British do not want to risk a war. And they're starting to kind of really feel guilty. It's been 15 years since the Treaty of Versailles, and they're kind of treated like it is like German land. Like, maybe we've taken this far enough. And they're very pacifist. They want peace at any price. And so France will not counter, which Hitler would have immediately pulled out of this situation if they had. And it's just ironic because France was still more powerful than Germany and may have been able to defeat and remove Hitler, but with British's pacifism and the really clear memories of World War I, they're very reluctant to risk another world war with Germany. And so, maybe they're, in hindsight, thinking World War I. I know the U.S. thought that getting involved in World War I was a huge mistake. And they're like, maybe the Germans do need this living space or Lebensraum. And maybe democracy is just not for everyone, like Woodrow Wilson had said in the 14 points. Maybe we don't need to force it on them. And it takes two to fight. So if we don't come in and fight, maybe there won't be a war. And so for the first time since World War I, Germany now had troops close to the Franco-German border, and this is going to pose a major threat to France's security, but also just really show Hitler and give him that extra courage to continue on, because no one has stepped in. They're appeasing him. No one has stepped in to stop him. Okay, so now we're back to Japan for just another little piece. I told you we'd talk about them a couple times in this lecture, so we have to kind of exit Europe for a little bit, but it's going to come back to play an important role in World War II. So we'd seen Japan invade Manchuria in 1931, and now we're going to see Japan, with a little slap on the wrist they got from the League, invade China in 1937. And this is going to be called the Rape of Nanking. I think it says Shanghai in your notes, but change it to Nanking. And so we're going to see that this is literally rape, because they're going to rape, defeat them, but they're also going to rape women, every woman. So if you're a woman hiding, they're going to rape you, and then they're going to look at those monks, those Confucian monks who've taken that vow of celibacy, and they're going to be like, oh, wouldn't that be funny if we held a gun to his head and make him actually rape women, or we'll kill you. But then of course they're going to kill him after. And actually there's going to be some contests or competitions even in the front news or pages of the newspaper on how many people did you kill. It's like a competition, and they're going to cut off the heads to show the numbers that they've killed. And so they're going to actually kill so many people during this raping of Nanking, which is actually a book by Iris Chang, if you ever get a chance to read it. I mean, it's just gross and grotesque what goes on at this time period. They're actually going to run out of burial space because they kill so many people. And so some images right here are going to get pretty graphic, but just to show you how horrific it was, and that the world just sits and watches. And this is just even with what Hitler did, one of the greatest examples of how weak the League of Nations is. Here's some images of just the massive, grotesque killings that take place in the raping of Nanking. Swords, we're going to see bayoneting, a lot of the removal of the heads for that contest here. So just really grotesque, mass killings. Really the horrors of if there was a League of Nations, this would be what they were supposed to stop. And they just do not. Bayoneting here. And then there's the heads, like for the competition to show how many people you've killed. I mean, just the horrors that come out of this time period, even before World War II. So you can just definitely see what we're moving towards. And just stick with it, like on the front pages of newspapers, like it's acceptable and the whole world knows and is just watching. I mean, just like women and children. Horrors of this aggressive nationalism in this time period. And the guy's like smiling and like, look what he's holding in his hand. Like, oh, look, I get another one to show how many people I've killed. And Japan's really able to do this because they have shaped themselves like the West. They were the only, part of that world that hasn't been colonized like China or anything, because they learned from the Europeans how army techniques and technology building up to World War II. So we're going to pick up after this with Germany's conquest as Germany moves forward, as they've shown that no one's going to step in to stop them. And that'll be part 2 of 10.2 in class next week.